Okay, I'm going to ask a bunch of scattered questions,
Sure.
actually, on a number of different things here. One is just a question of curiosity and interest for me. I know in the last 10, 15 years, there's developed a new, I don't know if it's called a branch or movement in philosophy called field metaphysics.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the people in this area here do draw upon Spinoza. Primarily, they don't. Primarily, this is an out branch of interest in Eastern philosophies.
Oh.
And some of them connect their views with Spinoza. And in fact, I've heard somebody argue that Spinoza was Buddhist almost and so forth. So I was just wondering if you know anything about that, and if you do, what you think of as a possible connection
That's a great question.
between Spinoza and Buddhism.
Yeah, well, that's a fantastic question. I don't know the specific use of Spinoza's field metaphysics other than today, but I have heard some analogies of Spinoza and Buddhism. Spinoza and Taoism, too, but less often. Although where I've heard the connection between Spinoza and Buddhism is in Spinoza's account of the passions. So Spinoza talks a lot about understanding your passions, and they don't control you anymore, you have control over them. And apparently Buddhists are saying something a little bit similar with respect to the passions. But I do know that there is this notion in Buddhism of no self, right? Where really nothing really is ultimately a separate entity from anything else. Everything is kind of a manner or an instance of the one in a certain sense. And what I've heard about this, it does sound a lot like field metaphysics in this regard.
I think that's where the people start to make connections. I'm just wondering where it goes beyond that.
Yeah.
That exhausts
That exhausts my knowledge of Buddhism too, other than the passions, which I find a very interesting parallel. That's about as much as I know. I don't know as much about Buddhism as I should, perhaps.
Okay. I'm going to ask a different sort of question here, something that's always puzzled me about this in general. Now, problems of circularity aside here, a conatus is the principle of individuation for Spinoza. The conatus is usually defined not in more physicalistic terms, and Professor Rice here is saying that ultimately it has to be explained in terms of, but in terms of a striving or a so forth. Now, here's the question I have for you. If that is a central aspect of reality, if individuals are in some way individuated in terms of conatus, and if conatus is, as it appears on the surface, a notion which is teleological, because that's what it sounds like to me, and yet Spinoza notoriously rejects teleology.
Yes.
What do we do? What do we do then to make the system compatible? Something's got to be done here, it seems to me, because it sounds like it's straight out of Aristotle. It sounds like what you're saying is that there's a teleological principle that permeates all reality because it permeates all individuals. In fact, individuals are, in effect, distinguished from one another in terms of this teleological principle. So my question is, how do we make them compatible?
That's a very good question, because I was concerned a lot about that myself in doing the research. Bennett actually thinks that Spinoza denies teleology and is just inconsistent and has to have it for his theory of individuals. He says something like that. I tried a different route, and I'm not going to read this, but I'm going to call attention to the section where I deal with this too. It might be in chapter 2. It's in chapter 2. And organism and teleonomy, which is at the end of chapter 2, 66 to 70. And what I argue there is Spinoza rejects specific conception of teleology. There's no divine intentionality, clearly for Spinoza. There's not a God saying, I think I'll bring about this state of affairs. And there aren't Aristotelian final causes. I think that Spinoza thinks we're driven by our appetites, so we're pushed, I guess, rather than pulled. And so I would think that that teleology that he rejects is understood kind of, it's specifically those two areas, Aristotelian final causes or something like it, and divine intentionality. But Errol Harris has argued that, I don't entirely agree with him here, but he's argued that we should think of it as kind of teleonomic, where indeed there's an ordering principle of substance or nature. And the laws of that principle, the laws of nature, the nature of that whole individual substance govern everything else. They must be understood within their place in the larger whole. And that seems teleonomic, Harris says. I kind of like that term. I don't know what everybody else thinks of it. But I think if that's a kind of teleology, this is what I would say, if that's a sort of teleology, then I would say Spinoza actually doesn't reject it. It would be my position. But if teleology is defined as having some sort of potentiality or final causality built into the system, I think he clearly rejects that. But if this teleonomy is a way of doing teleology, I think that he has one. But I don't know exactly how teleology.
Or else you're going to have to give a very different spin to the notion of conatus, right?
Right, that's Dr. Weiss.
That's basically, it seems to me, otherwise you do have teleology in there somewhere. I mean, you could stretch it out so it has to do with the universe as a whole or something of that kind, but you still have teleology somewhere.
Yeah, and I think that we might have to bite the bullet on that and say he does have a kind of teleology.
Okay, let me ask you a couple of other questions here. I'm still not clear in your final chapters here, is Spinoza a psychological egoist?
Okay.
Define the psychological egoist as somebody who says there's one basic or primary motive underlying all other motives. And so they're all, in certain sense, outgrowths of that motive. And the motive is a striving for self-interest, which may cash out primarily in terms of survival or preservation or something of that kind. So if that's what we mean by psychological egoism, is, despite the fact that we're trying to soften it up a little bit, as you try to do toward the end of the dissertation, is Spinoza ultimately a psychological egoist?
Well, it's a good question, and I think that it has to do with how narrowly we define. I've been wondering about egoism myself, and I was actually just teaching this in my ethics course last week there at the College of Lake County. Is egoism the view that the only reason I do something is that I've thought it out, and I thought I'm going to do this for my self-interest? I kind of took it as I was writing the dissertation to be a
that would make it pretty easy to answer empirical questions, wouldn't it? I mean, I thought it's supposed to be something a little bit deeper than that. That's
what I'm thinking. Yeah, I think that maybe it's a little bit more sophisticated. And he's certainly not, let's say, a psychological egoist in that sort of crude calculative sense. But I no longer hold to the position that it's impossible that he's an egoist if egoism is a more nuanced. If, for example, suppose that, I think Spinoza holds that the well-being of something or someone I love is as important to me as my own. But, and I suspect he denies that I think, well, it's important to me because I care about myself, but it may be a much deeper connection. I care about myself, and because they're connected to me in this way, I care about them. And if that's still psychological egoism, then I think, yeah, there's not really a problem with calling that. Now, in the dissertation, I take it in that more simple sense, but I've been thinking about it since then, and I think, well, maybe if we really flesh this out, maybe it's not a problem to read it.
What's the more simple sense? I just missed that.
Oh, that I thought to myself,
consciously.
Yeah, it's all here. It's all deliberate. Yeah. And I've read some thinkers who describe it that way, but it seems like the more I read and teach about it, the deeper it seems in some positions too. So.
Yeah, let me ask you again. I'm kind of scattered questions all over the place here. One of the questions that bothered me from the start of the dissertation actually has been explored by Professor Starr here, and it seems like a very tenuous connection between the metaphysics and the ethics, and then another almost as tenuous as one between the ethics and the social political.
Okay.
But that's okay. We've talked about that.
Okay.
Toward the end of your dissertation, you talk about the state and obedience to the state. Let me just ask this sort of question here. And obviously, there is what sound like Hobbesian strands in a lot of his political philosophy, even if it should be distinguished for reasons. Professor Rice has talked about some of his articles from the actual view of Hobbes here. But under what conditions here? And are they simply the conditions identified by Hobbes, or are they other than that? Under what conditions would civil disobedience be permissible in a synergistic state?
One of my first papers I ever wrote on Spinoza was actually on Spinoza. I wrote this for Steve Barboni, on Spinoza and civil disobedience. And I did struggle with that quite a bit, because there's so many passages where he says, as long as it's more rational to live in the state than not, you must not disobey. And what I had argued in that paper then, and I think it's still the right approach, that Spinoza could have a theory of civil disobedience if we were to allow certain situations in which the state loses its authority. So, for example, we know that the state can lose its authority when it makes absolutely irrational demands or compels a person to go against their own essence. He says this several times. My approach then was, okay, in terms of civil disobedience, must we have this strong reaction? Either the state has its authority and obey it at all costs, or it loses its authority and now it's gone and I'm in a state of nature. Couldn't it be in a state of nature with respect to certain laws and still have proper civil
That's my
authority?
question. What are those situations here? Because I don't think either of the extremes are probably not correct.
Right.
It's not as though the state doesn't, there seems to be good evidence that Mr. T has been shaking me down for money. Okay, state is not doing anything about it
Yes.
despite this predominant evidence here. Now, the state should be protecting me, arresting Mr. T if possible, locking him up, confining him again if possible, doing that sort of thing, but they're not doing it. But otherwise, it's okay. Some guy cuts me off and they give the guy a ticket, and, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Is it okay for me to shake down Mr. T?
Oh, that's a good question. You could take it in your own hands and just grab it.
Yeah, I'm saying under what
Yeah.
conditions with civil disobedience, taking the law into your own hands or disregarding the state?
Disregarding the law. And I think that the only conditions that would be allowed is that you've got a law that is part of an institution of laws. I'll give you an example in a moment. Part of an institution of laws that systematically go against your, subvert your desire of not your desire, subvert that self-preservation. For example, take Martin Luther King with his